All right, so for this explainer, we're digging into a source with a pretty bold claim. It's all about modern U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and it centers on a strategy document from way back in 1996. The big question it asks is whether the goals in that document have been quietly shaping American military auctions for decades.
So, right off the bat, the source lays out its central claim, and it doesn't pull any punches. It argues that a 1996 Israeli strategy paper called A Clean Break is basically the real blueprint for what the U.S. does in the region. It goes on to say that this document, not what we're told are American interests, was the actual reason for the wars in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. The goal? To benefit Israel by knocking over its rivals.
Now that's a huge claim, right? A small country pulling the strings of a superpower. So the natural next question is, how? If this is true, what are the mechanics behind it? Well, the source we're looking at breaks it down into three big interconnected systems.
Well, according to this source, the first piece of the puzzle is all about money, a lot of money. It calls it a cycle of money, and it all supposedly starts with U.S. foreign aid.
And when we talk about aid, the numbers the source highlights are just staggering. We're talking about a total of $300 billion since Israel was created. And get this, according to the source, 2/3 of that, a whopping $200 billion, was specifically for military spending. So, how does that money translate into influence? Well, this slide lays out the source's theory, which it pretty bluntly calls a money laundering scheme. Here's how it's supposed to work. Step 1, U.S. taxpayers fund this massive aid package. Step 2, Israel uses that money to buy weapons from American defense contractors. Step 3, and this is the key part, that money then gets funneled back to wealthy donors right here in the U.S. And finally, Step 4, those donors and corporations turn around and lobby politicians for, you guessed it, more aid. It's described as this perfect self-fueling loop.
Okay, so we've followed the money, but how does that cash actually turn into political power? That brings us to the second mechanism the source lays out, a combination of intense lobbying, bribery, and even blackmail.
For the lobbying part, the source points a finger directly at groups like AIPAC. It claims that if you look at the numbers, candidates backed by the group have something like a 97% win rate in elections. The argument here is that this kind of success rate effectively guarantees a friendly Congress. And this isn't just an outsider's theory, according to the source. They use this quote from a sitting congressman, Thomas Massie, to suggest this is basically an open secret in Washington. He's quoted saying that his colleagues admit they can't vote their conscience because of the political heat they take back home. It's a pretty startling claim. But then, the source takes things a step further, into much darker territory. It alleges that on top of lobbying, there was a systematic blackmail operation run through Jeffrey Epstein's network to compromise politicians. It names figures like Les Wexner and Ghislaine Maxwell as key players. The source even points to former President Trump as a grand example of this, suggesting that some powerful people actually prefer to have compromised colleagues because they're easier to control. So you've got the money cycle and the political machine. But how do you keep the public on board with all this? That's where the third and final mechanism comes in, according to the source, controlling the flow of information. The source provides a list of what it calls propaganda tactics. It alleges things like fabricated stories making headlines, major news outlets being compromised, and using very specific misleading language. For instance, using a headline that obscures what really happened, or using dehumanizing language for victims, even labeling journalists who are killed as militants. The argument is that all these things together shape a public narrative that's favorable to these policies.
But how could that even be possible, to control so much of the media? Well, the source points to the structure of corporate ownership. It makes the claim that a huge chunk of top companies, we're talking 88% of the S&P 500, including the big media conglomerates, are majority owned by just 3 giant asset funds, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. The implication is, if you only need to influence a tiny handful of people at the top, controlling the overall narrative becomes a whole lot easier.
So, that brings us to the bottom line, the final consequence laid out in the source. After explaining these alleged systems of money, politics, and media, it asks a simple question: what's the price for the average American?
And the source presents this really stark comparison. On one side, you have the situation in the U.S., with things like expensive health care, crushing education costs, and rising homelessness. On the other side, it points to Israel, where it claims American aid helps fund things like free healthcare and free education for its own citizens. The argument is that Americans are essentially funding social programs abroad that they don't have access to at home. And really, this is what the source's entire argument boils down to.
American taxpayer money is presented as the fuel for this whole engine. It funds the aid, which is then allegedly used to lobby and bribe American politicians to get even more aid. The thesis is that Americans are paying to have their own system turned against their own interests.
And so the source leaves us with this one big provocative question. It doesn't give an answer, it just puts it out there for you to think about. What if that cycle was broken? What would happen to U.S. foreign policy, to life here at home, and to stability in the Middle East if the aid just stopped? That's the thought we're left with.